having. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to join you all today for your seminar series. Yeah, I heard about this and was really excited to talk with a bunch of folks that are working in kind of a related but different field as mine. So I'm really excited to have a conversation with you all today. Today I'd love to share some research that we've been conducting on quantifying the risk of forced labor in fisheries using satellite data and machine learning. First, I just want to acknowledge a great team of collaborators I've had. We work across a range of organizations from our group at UCSB. We also have very close collaborators at Global Fishing Watch, who provide one of the main data sets we use on fishing vessel activity. We've also had collaborators from Google, as well as a few other organizations such as Liberty Shared, who's a group that works on human rights issues. And I want to also acknowledge the great financial support we've had from a number of groups. I just wanted to thank all of my great collaborators. Now, before we begin, like I said, this is a really new audience to me, so I'd love to just gauge everyone's familiarity with the topic of labor abuses in fisheries. Is this something you've read about in the newspapers or heard about in other venues, or is it just a totally brand new topic to you? So I'd love to just kind of hear how familiar you are. Awesome. Okay, so it looks like a lot of folks, not at all, or only slightly, or somewhat, or just one moderately. So this is great. So it's really exciting to share something, I guess, brand new for a lot of folks, or pretty new for a lot of folks. Myself included, I was very unfamiliar with this topic as well before I started working on it. I've mostly been doing research in fisheries management, so how to sustainably manage fisheries. And so the whole human rights and labor dimension of things was very new to me. And I think historically, fisheries science and the human rights space haven't been too connected up until very recently. And so, yeah, this was a very new topic for me too, and I'm still learning. So really excited to share what I've learned so far. So yeah, forced labor has been widely documented in fisheries for at least the last 8 years or so now. There was a really big effort by the Associated Press. It was a series called Seafood from Slaves that actually won the Pulitzer Prize. A bunch of articles came out, titles like this: "Slaves may have caught the food, caught the fish you bought," "Global supermarkets selling shrimp peeled by slaves." These are really grabbing and damaging titles for articles being put out. You may have also seen a great series in the New York Times by Ian Orbina called "The Outlaw Ocean." Couple of other titles that really kind of grab your attention: "The Human Misery That Feeds Pets and Livestock." These are really kind of very important titles to pay attention to and to think about. And what's really exciting is a lot of that press coverage did lead to some action. Following the Associated Press article, over 300 slaves were rescued from an island in Indonesia. There was a big effort by Obama to ban US imports of slave-produced goods. And so it was really encouraging to see that as more attention was paid to this issue, some action was being taken. But really, the issue persists. And so these are just a couple of reports by a couple of organizations that are still really active in this space, from Environmental Justice Foundation and Greenpeace. They've been really active in putting out reports that are really documenting this issue on the ground. Even the Mindrew Foundation, who puts out the Global Slavery Index, now has a whole section of that index that is focused on slavery in fisheries. And so really this problem has persisted. And as a scientist and academic researcher, I think it's really great to see that the scientific literature is starting to pay attention as well. And so here are just a couple of kind of high-profile articles that have come out in the last few years. And a big part of the scientific research has been moving towards a growing call for socially responsible seafood. For years, we've been talking about the environmental sustainability of seafood, but I think tying that in with the socially responsible aspect of seafood is really, really important. And when I say social responsibility in seafood, I think this encompasses not just, the absence of slavery or forced labor, but also human rights and decent working conditions generally. But today I'm really going to be talking about the issue of forced labor. But even with all this scientific research already out there, one of the big gaps in the literature until very recently was the true extent of the problem. How many fishing boats are we talking about here that are actually using this? Where are they fishing? What ports are they visiting? And that's really where our research came into play. And so the kind of four main questions we hope to answer in our research is, can we actually build a predictive machine learning model that can identify individual fishing vessels that have suspected forced labor? And to do this, we're going to use satellite-based vessel monitoring data from Global Fishing Watch and a methodology I'll go into in a bit more detail shortly. So if we can even build that model, and that was a big if for us when we first started this, we weren't even sure this was possible, but if we could build this model, which ports are these vessels using and where might they be fishing? Next, I think, given the kind of real world and very important implications of how this model might be used, we really wanted to make sure how accurate and fair is this predictive model. Accusing someone of potentially having forced labor on their fishing boat is a really it's a strong accusation, and we certainly don't make any accusations with our model, but it could be kind of seen that way, and so we really want to make sure we're being as accurate and fair as possible with what we're doing here. And finally, if we could actually do all this, build the model, demonstrate that it's accurate and fair, how can interventions responsibly use the model outputs to actually help address this problem? As a researcher in this space, I'm not only interested in doing rigorous analyses, but also making sure those analyses can be put into hands of practitioners that can actually use them. So to put out a couple of definitions first before we move on. So in this work, we are really focused on forced labor, which is a type of modern slavery. And so the International Labor Organization, or ILO, defines this as all work or service exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty and for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. So we focused on forced labor for two big reasons. The first one being that it's been widely documented in fisheries through some of those articles I shared before. But we also hypothesized that if a vessel has forced labor on board, that they might actually behave in different ways that we could actually see using remotely sensed satellite-based vessel monitoring data. For example, they might stay out at sea for really long periods of time to avoid port oversight. And so we expect that, if vessels are using forced labor, we could actually pick this up in the data by looking at the satellite-based vessel tracks of these data. Now, the ILO also puts out a list of indicators of forced labor. So these are things that would indicate that, that a particular situation might be using forced labor. And these are the indicators that we're really going to use in our analysis. And another quick little poll for the group. Curious to know how much you all know about the ILO indicators of forced labor. And so this question is, which of the following is an ILO indicator of forced labor? Give you guys a minute here to look over the options. Awesome. Yes. So many of you are correct that the answer is all of the above. A lot of times when we think about forced labor, maybe we're thinking about, the most abusive working and living conditions or things like physical violence. Maybe we're also thinking about withholding of wages. But it's also things like retention of identity documents, taking someone's passport away and not allowing them to have it back. Or things like debt bondage. For example, folks might start working on a fishing vessel, and then as they're working on it, the captain won't let them go because they're kind of indebted into the vessel. For example, they might have to pay for the food that they're eating on the boat, or pay for a portion of the fuel the boat's using. And yeah, so these are the 11 indicators of forced labor by the ILO. Yeah, kind of ranging from excessive overtime and wage and identity document issues, all the way up to the very worst, most egregious forms of physical and sexual violence and so forth. Now, you might wonder how a fisheries scientist like myself even got into this space. What even tipped us off to start thinking about this and analyzing this? And so some collaborators of mine put out a paper a couple years ago about the economics of fishing on the high seas. And in this paper, what they found is that a lot of fishing on the high seas appears to not be profitable at all. In fact, it appears anywhere on this map that has the kind of yellow-red color, it appears, based on our best possible assumptions, that those vessels should be losing money. Now, there's maybe a couple of reasons why this might be the case. Maybe those vessels are subsidized by their governments to fish. But even accounting for subsidies, we still see a lot of this red and yellow. But one of the alternative explanations is that those vessels might not be paying their crew as much as we would expect them to be. And they might not even be paying some of their crew at all. And that could possibly be explaining why these vessels would be continuing to fish in this way that to an outsider looks like they shouldn't be making any money at all. So that really got us to thinking, all right, can we use the same data that this paper used to really dig into the issue of forced labor? And one of the key data sources from this paper was Global Fishing Watch. And I really would love to share with you a little bit about how Global Fishing Watch works. I think it's just both interesting and also really relevant to understanding, the usefulness of a model like this. So every vessel globally that's above a certain size is required to broadcast their location via this system called AIS, the Automatic Identification System. And this was really designed originally to be a safety at sea measure to help make sure that vessels don't collide with each other, like these two here, which kind of look like they're on a crash course. And so these vessels have a little transponder on board that is sending off messages that can either be picked up by a receiver on ground or by satellites. And so satellites are kind of circling the Earth 24/7, picking up these messages. And a couple of the big satellite providers are Spire and Orbcomm, and that's where Global Fishing Watch gets their data from. So what's really neat, though, is that Spire and Orbcomm have allowed researchers like Global Fishing Watch to tap into this system to do really, really novel things with it. And so what we're doing is actually focusing in on how fishing vessels are using this system. And so globally, this is a density map of vessels with AIS, and we're talking a lot of data here. So over 300,000 vessels use this system in any given year. So that's both fishing and non-fishing vessels. And we're talking billions and billions of data points. And so each time one of these vessels has a latitude and longitude and a timestamp, it's getting sent up to a satellite, which is then being sent to this kind of centralized database. So how can we use this to say something about fishing? And this is where I think it gets really exciting. So fishing vessels have these really distinctive movement patterns in the water that can kind of tip you off to the type of fishing they might be doing. So trawling on the left has this kind of movement where they're moving back and forth, trawling along the bottom of the ocean. Long lines also have this very distinctive movement where they're moving back and forth in these straight lines. They might be operating often in deeper waters, and we can also see the depth of all of this happening. And then purse seines, which is how a lot of tunas are caught, kind of have these circular motions where they're actually circling around perhaps a school of tuna. And so Global Fishing Watch have built these really neat machine learning algorithms that can basically take these vessel tracks and look at them and basically determine, is this a fishing vessel? And if so, what type of fishing is it doing? And is it actually fishing at any given moment? And so they have put this all out into some really, really neat data sets that are publicly available that researchers around the world, like folks at our group, have been able to tap into. And it really has kind of fundamentally changed the type of research we're able to do. And so here's just a map of what that kind of processed version of the data set looks like. So all of the green or the blue dots are the AIS-based fishing activity from vessels over a certain period of time. The yellow is from another type of satellite system, which is called vessel monitoring system. And then all the little red dots are where there's suspected encounters between two fishing vessels. And I'll come back to this. But a large kind of issue happening in fisheries is that oftentimes vessels will meet up at sea and actually transfer their catch. So this is happening without going back to port at all. And there's nothing inherently bad or illegal about this, but what it does is it enables vessels to stay out at sea for very, very long periods of time, potentially even indefinitely. But what's really exciting about Global Fishing Watch is we can see these events happening in near real time. So now that you know a little bit more about Global Fishing Watch, so how do we actually use Global Fishing Watch to look at forced labor? And so we put together a three-pronged approach. So Global Fishing Watch supplies the satellite vessel monitoring data in the upper right. But the next thing we need to do is in the upper left, which is basically compile a list of vessels that have suspected forced labor abuse. And to do this, we talked with human rights practitioners and kind of combed through the gray literature, a lot of reports, like I mentioned before, from groups like Greenpeace and Environmental Justice Foundation. And it turns out there's a lot of information out there on specific vessels that were caught for using forced labor. And we can actually track those vessels in Global Fishing Watch and see what they were doing. So to explain how we did this, I wanted to just share a little story about a Thai flagged longliner. So this is one of those longline fishing vessels, and this is their AIS activity track. And in the orange little dots are where this vessel was fishing. The green dots is where the vessel was anchored, and the purple dots are where it's just transiting, just kind of moving along. And these blue lines are gaps in AIS. And so we can actually see both when the vessel is transmitting, but also we can see where there are big gaps as well. So a manager for a major tuna company was arrested in January 2016 for operating fishing vessels in foreign waters without a license. And so you can see that on the left in these exclusive economic zones off of Africa. The manager was also charged for a number of violations indicative of forced labor, including exploitation of vulnerable migrant workers who didn't have work permits, denying these workers copies of their employment contracts, failing to pay them for overtime, denying rest hours, etc. And so using Global Fishing Watch, we were able to actually observe this vessel's activity in the time leading up to the arrest. And we can see several suspicious behaviors. We can see some really long voyages with very few port visits. So this boat is staying out at sea for a really long period of time. They're fishing in foreign exclusive economic zones, and which is often illegal, not always, but often. And also there's large gaps in AIS transmission. And so it is possible to turn off these AIS devices. Now there may be legitimate reasons to do that, but they could also be doing that to cover up what they're doing. And so that's kind of a suspicious behavior to see these really, really large gaps in AIS transmission. And so this is just the activity from one vessel, but we looked at others, and here are just a couple of other snapshots of some other vessels and kind of what they were doing in the time before they were caught using forced labor. So all in all, after going through the gray literature and discussing with human rights practitioners, we found 22 individual fishing vessels that we could actually match up to Global Fishing Watch AIS data. And so these are vessels that all indicated one of the 11 ILO forced labor indicators. They all had, at the very least, an eyewitness account. Some of them had official investigations, maybe even arrests. One thing you'll note is a lot of these haven't actually gone fully through the kind of prosecution system. While there may have been some arrests, there's only a handful of cases where there are actually penalties sanctioned. And so for this first analysis, we used these 22 vessels and basically looked to see what these vessels were doing before they were caught for using forced labor. Now we're working on some follow-on work right now, which is bringing this up closer to 80 vessels, which is really great. One of the limitations of our initial analysis was that there's only so much you can glean from 22 vessels, but now we can look at 78 vessels, which is really great. So curious to hear some of your thoughts. So for these vessels that we know had suspected forced labor on board, which of the following can be tracked using AIS from these fishing vessels? So this AIS is this satellite-based vessel monitoring system I've been talking about. Okay, great. Yeah, most of you are right. The only one of these we can actually track is time at sea between ports. And so, yeah, using Global Fishing Watch, we can see when a vessel um, comes to a port. We can see when they leave it, when we can see when they arrive at the next port. And so, yeah, this is an important indicator of, how long is this vessel staying out at sea? But you may remember that's not actually an ILO indicator of forced labor. There's nothing necessarily wrong with staying out at sea for long periods of time. Really, the ILO indicators of forced labor were things like, yeah, retention of identity documents and abusive living conditions. But those sorts of things we really can't see with AIS data that's really just showing where a vessel is on the ocean. And so I think that's important to keep in mind when kind of interpreting the results of our analysis is we can't actually directly see forced labor at all using satellite data, but we can really just see suspicious behaviors. And human rights experts helped us make a list of what to look for. And there's all sorts of both vessel characteristics and behaviors that we can look at. We can look at what type of gear vessels are using, the type of flag that they're flying. So, are they flying a flag of convenience or a flag from, a specific country? How big are these vessels? Are these vessels on an illegal fishing list? So there are lists maintained by Interpol and others about whether or not vessels are known to illegally fish. And then there's all these behaviors that we can actually see. So again, none of these are ILO indicators of forced labor, but they're all consistent with the cases that we know have happened with forced labor on board. They're staying out at sea for really long periods of time. They're fishing many hours a day. And again, we can see how many hours a day a boat is fishing. We can see if they're fishing in foreign exclusive economic zones. We can see if they're transshipping, which is this thing I was talking about earlier, where two vessels meet up with each other and maybe transfer catch. We can also see if they have gaps in AIS transmission, which again is maybe suspicious. And so where machine learning comes into all of this is we can look at all these things for the 22 boats that have forced labor, but we can also look at this for all the other vessels out there that don't have any documented forced labor on board. And basically, we can build a machine learning model with all those other vessels and our 22 to kind of differentiate between whether or not a vessel is kind of behaving like one of those 22 forced labor boats or whether it's behaving like all the other boats. And so once we built this model, and we use 16,000 vessels actually across different longline, squid jigger, and trawling fishing vessels, we can basically say whether or not we think each of those 16,000 vessels is behaving like our 22 forced labor boats. And so really the first question in our minds was, could we actually build this model to identify individual fishing vessels? Again, we weren't sure if we could at the beginning of this, but the answer is yes. Indeed, vessels that use forced labor behave differently in ways that we can observe using AIS data. These are typically vessels with bigger engines. They travel further distances from port. They have fewer voyages per year because they're staying out at sea a lot longer. They're fishing a lot more hours per day, and they're also fishing a lot more on the high seas. And so these are all kind of things we might expect after having looked through all the literature and read about all the cases of forced labor on specific boats. So with this model, we can actually now make predictions about the presence of forced labor on other vessels. And what was really shocking to us is that the problem is pervasive. So up to about a quarter of the vessels that we looked at were predicted as being high risk, suspected of having forced labor. And again, we're not accusing any of these vessels of anything, but simply saying that this model thinks that these vessels behave and act in a way that's similar to other vessels that have been caught for forced labor. And what's also really shocking is while a quarter of the vessels were predicted as being high risk, this actually counts for 1 out of every 2 crew members because those vessels were actually quite big and have a lot of crew working on them. So this to us was a really kind of scary statistic. 1 out of every 2 crew members of the boats we looked at might be working on a boat with forced labor. So for the next couple slides, I just want to show you some maps of longline vessels, but again, we also looked at this with squid jiggers and trawlers, but you can kind of look at that in the paper if you're interested in digging in more. So where were these vessels landing? And so this is a map globally of where those vessels were kind of entering or exiting ports. And all in all, high-risk vessels visited ports across 53 developed and developing countries in 2018, which was nearly half of all countries that were visited by longlines, predominantly in Asia, Africa, and South America. But you'll see on there, Canada, United States, New Zealand, Spain are in there too. Additionally, these ports are found in 26 countries that have already ratified the Port State Measures Agreement, which has stipulations in there about kind of preventing illegal fishing vessels from entering their ports. So now that we can kind of have this information, this could potentially be really useful for interventions by enforcement agencies. These ports represent potential sources of exploited labor, as well as transfer points for seafood caught using forced labor. And so we've been working with a couple of groups that can kind of use this information to help prioritize port inspections. As you may know, with enforcement, there's always limited resources. There's no way to monitor everything. And so if there's any way to kind of more strategically direct those limited resources, can be really helpful. And so here's a map of where those vessels were actually fishing. And so this is a map of the fraction of fishing effort globally of long lines that were suspected to be high risk of forced labor. And really, again, it's pretty shocking. The spatial extent of where these vessels are fishing is global. So yeah, this to us was a really surprising finding. But when we showed this to human rights experts and folks who have been working on the ground and kind of looking at some of these vessels, they actually weren't as surprised as we were, which was also shocking to us. So now that we've kind of built this model and are able to look at things like this, how can we actually use it? And so there are a number of different types of interventions that can help address this problem. These top three really important interventions to address underlying drivers. For example, issues facing migrant workers who are often the victims of forced labor. Implementation of policies such as ILO C-188, which is the Work in Fishing Convention. This is a really important policy that has not been widely adopted yet. And so I think, implementing these sorts of policies, which stipulate, minimum worker conditions for fishing vessels could be really important. And also, of course, interventions that provide victim assistance are key here. So all these three are important, but not things that we can really address with our particular work we've been talking about here. So let's turn to some things that maybe we could inform with this work. Of course, enforcement interventions. I already talked a little bit about how port inspections could leverage this by prioritizing which ports they might want to have enforcement agents at. But you could also imagine this could help prioritize inspections at sea. And so we've actually been working a little bit with the US Coast Guard to help inform some of their at-sea inspections. They actually have Coast Guard vessels traveling around looking for issues related to both illegal fishing and forced labor on fishing vessels. And then there's another set of interventions I wanted to just touch on in the last couple minutes. And these are market-based interventions and also fisheries management body labor condition mandates. And so this first one on market-based interventions is one potential solution space we think is pretty exciting. And so when I say market-based interventions, I mean things like eco-certifications, labels, risk assessment tools, things like that. You guys may be familiar with the Marine Stewardship Council. So they certify whether or not fish is caught sustainably, so like environmental sustainability. You may see this label on tuna cans in the supermarket where you buy food. But they're also working on adding in new requirements to their certification that include human rights, kind of minimum worker conditions as well. You may also be familiar with the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch program, which also kind of gives a kind of report card or scorecard on seafood sustainability. They've also been thinking a lot about the issue of human rights, and they've partnered up with the Sustainable Fisheries Partnership on an exciting new collaboration called the Seafood Slavery Risk Tool to kind of, similar to the Seafood Watch sustainability, to kind of look at how different seafood products, how kind of socially responsible those seafood products are. And so we think this is it's an emerging space. It's still, fairly new, and, there's certainly lots of issues to work through, but we think this is a really exciting one to keep an eye on, and also something we hope that our work could potentially inform. And the last kind of solution space I want to talk about are regional fishery management organizations. And so a lot of tuna species, which is one of the most widely caught species in the world, are managed by these 5 large regional fishery management organizations. Now, traditionally, they all focus on fishery sustainability. So making sure that the stock is being fished in a way that's not going to cause a stock collapse, making sure that the gears being used are responsible, and that things like bycatch are being avoided as much as possible. And so each of these 5 organizations is kind of responsible for a different area of the ocean. But in recent years, there's been discussions of, all right, could we actually expand the mandates of these organizations to also include ensuring that vessels fishing in these areas have decent working conditions for the folks working on those vessels? Just kind of curious to hear your thoughts on how much progress has been made on this aspect so far. How many of these 5 major tuna management organizations have adopted minimum labor standards for crew on their fishing vessels? Just kind of curious to hear what your off the cuff thoughts are. All right. Seems like kind of a range of answers here. A couple folks choosing one from each of the columns. Well, it turns out actually none of them have. The Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission does have a non-binding article in there about labor conditions for the crew, but it's still non-binding, and none of the other ones have them. What's interesting is that some of these organizations do have labor standards for observers. So fisheries observers are folks that work on fishing vessels, not as fishermen themselves, but just to observe and to make sure that things like bycatch are being avoided. So they're kind of counting up, if sea turtles are being caught on the fish. They're also making sure that, they're reporting, how much tuna they're catching, so that managers can know how much is being caught. And so oftentimes observers actually do have minimum labor standards, but the actual crew, the people actually doing the fishing, don't. And this I find really shocking, but I also find this to be, a potential really big opportunity for these organizations to kind of add in these mandates. There's kind of an ongoing debate right now over like the legal ability to do this, whether or not these organizations can actually require that vessels have minimum labor standards. But I think it's an interesting debate, and I think it's a really promising avenue. So to summarize some of our key findings, so we did find that machine learning could be used to build a model like this to identify suspected forced labor. There's, of course, some really big caveats. I haven't had enough time today to go into them, but there are some big ones. And so I think it needs to be looked at carefully before it's really used. But really, forced labor is pervasive across all of the fishing gears we looked at. They're fishing throughout the oceans, and they're visiting ports throughout the globe. So as scary as some of this is, we're also really excited about the opportunities. Enforcement agencies can use models like this to more efficiently target limited resources. And we also think there's big opportunities for fisheries management bodies and eco-certifications to kind of help promote forced labor. I mean, to promote decent working conditions and address forced labor, rather. Really, these groups have been focused on environmental sustainability for years, which is great, but they're really poised now to start promoting social responsibility as well. I think one really key thing for us as we work through this is keeping transparent about the approach and the limitations and the fairness metrics of the modeling can really help ensure responsible use of the results. There's actually been a really interesting kind of dialogue happening in the literature. The approach is not a silver bullet, and the research continues. There were actually some a rebuttal article against our original paper talking about some of the big issues with our approach, and we completely acknowledge that, one of which being, we're basing a lot of this just on 22 vessels, which is not that much. And so we're actually working on a new paper now, which is currently in review, that has really increased the number of vessels we're able to look at. We're also diving a lot more deeply now into really assessing the fairness of the predictions we're making sure we're making fair predictions across different fishing flags and different regions, and that we don't have any sort of bias in the model. And so we're really taking this seriously in this kind of next phase of the research. So to just end, I wanted to just share some recent news that I find encouraging. So these are actually, from a year or two ago now, but U.S. Customs and Border Patrol has been taking action on some specific vessels that were found to have forced labor, and basically preventing these vessels from selling food to the U.S. market. And even this last one here is an entire fleet of Chinese fishing vessels by a certain company that was found to have forced labor rampant within the company, has been banned from selling seafood to the U.S. market. And very recently, Taiwan caught fish have once again been added to the Department of Labor's list of goods produced by child and forced labor. And so these goods are goods that should not be, kind of sold on the U.S. market. And this is not the first time Taiwanese caught fish have been on this list. There's also been a really interesting lawsuit filed also very recently by the International Labor Rights Forum, suing Bumblebee Tuna, who's one of the major suppliers of tuna worldwide, over false advertising about fair and safe fishing practices. And this was based on some really damning allegations from a recent Greenpeace report that found forced labor on vessels that are supplying some of the Bumblebee tuna. And so I think people are starting to really take this issue seriously, and there's a lot of really, really good work going on, from all sorts of different angles. And so I think the space is ripe for folks that are interested and have creative ideas for how to help address the problem. So yeah, with that, I want to again just thank my collaborators, thank our financial support, and also thank you all for participating and listening to my talk, and your answers to the survey questions, and also looking forward to hearing your questions now.